Everyone is speaking out about this. The center market in the NHL has somehow gotten even worse, and it was not good to begin with. And this puts the Islanders in a very interesting situation because they have a strength in this position, but they also have a challenging decision to make coming up. And this decision is becoming more challenging because the Islanders are a lot more competitive than I think a lot of people expected them to be this season. While we were really unsure this offseason about what this Islanders team was going to be, we were talking a lot about the prospect of trading Jean-Gabriel Pageau because it just seemed like that made sense with where the Islanders were likely going to be outside the playoffs. Now, so far, 20 games in, that they are in a position, it really makes that decision more interesting. And what really changed recently is we now have a better price gauge on the market as the Winnipeg Jets have signed their captain Adam Lowry to a contract extension for 5 years, $5 million. And why this is so interesting for the Islanders in this situation with Pageau, especially considering now with the Islanders being more competitive, there is more talk on whether or not it makes sense for the Islanders to keep Pageau rather than trading him for assets. We're going to talk about both scenarios on this episode of Islanders Digest. But why we're talking about Adam Lowry to start this conversation is because Lowry is a very similar player to Pageau in the role he plays. They play it in two different ways. Lowry is a very big, defensively strong player. Pageau is more that two-way third line center that provides you solid defense but provides a bit more offense. But these are both players who are highly coveted third line centers, and realistically they're both the type of player that a team expects when a team is trying to be competitive in the playoffs. They value this type of player. For Lowry to get this type of contract at age 32, got to keep in mind too, he missed the first part of the season because he was undergoing a hip surgery. For him to get this contract so soon after recovering from that injury, clearly, one, there's not a lot of players out there on the center market, and the ones who are out there are going to get paid. Now, it is worth noting that Lowry is the Jets captain. I do think this plays a factor into this decision, but 5 years, $5 million. This is a player now who's going to be under contract at age 37, perhaps even getting close to his age 38 season. With Pageau, I don't think it's going to be as long of a contract, especially considering so far in his career, Pageau has made more money than a player like Lowry. But ScotiaStat has this really interesting graphic. This is going into the season, talking about what the contract expectations for a player like Pageau is. And it has its prediction more around 3 years, around $5.5 million. It has that 5.6. I think that is a little high, but that is kind of around the range, especially when it comes, you got to keep in mind, with the NHL right now, yes, that's higher than Pageau's last contract. It's important to note, with the NHL, the salary cap has absolutely risen exponentially. When it comes to the percentage of the cap, which is really what GMs look at, this would be lower than the previous percentage that Pageau made. And that just begs the question, for around $5.5 million, we'll put it at $5 million just for this conversation, because I think that's more likely what it would be. At $5 million for 3 years, does it make sense for the Islanders to just trade Pageau for the biggest offer they can get, or does it make sense for them to keep Pageau at that price? And what I think is really interesting when it comes to the situation, first of all, is what does the Islanders' future at center look like? Now, this is what the Islanders had rolling as their lines a few days ago. Ritchie's now playing on the fourth line, but for the future, if the Islanders believe that Callum Ritchie is a second-line center, and they believe that Mathew Barzal is more of a right wing, then it would make sense, I think, for the Islanders to keep Pageau for 3 more years at his current price range. And I think, considering how much he loves Long Island, how much he loves this team, I think he would take a deal like that for 3 more years. Yes, it's not the longest deal he can get, but for a 33, he's going to be 33 when he signs his next contract. For a 33-year-old player, that is a pretty good deal to take, especially considering you're just coming off a previous 6-year, $5 million contract. And why I think that wouldn't be the worst decision for the Islanders, and something that's going to be really interesting, is we're going to talk about in a second. The rest of the third line centers out there on the market are not very good, and there are not many of them, so you're going to have to pay a lot. If you can get a fair deal for Pageau, keep in mind, with the Islanders, they do have a really intriguing prospect in Danny Nelson, who I believe, as of right now, is the third line center of the future. With Danny Nelson, I don't think this is a player who is going to come up to the NHL right away, and when he does come up, it would make sense for him to start in a fourth-line role and work his way up to the third-line center position. While I am a little frustrated with the Islanders playing Ritchie as the fourth-line center, because I do think he's too talented for that role, for a player like Nelson, who's a peak is likely a third line center, I think that makes a ton of sense. Now, the issue here with Pageau is the complications of just how long is it going to take for Richie to develop? Because if this is a situation where Richie needs to play some time as the third line center before he does finally make his emergence as a true second line center, then I think there's a logjam when it comes to the Islanders in the second line position. And in that sense, it makes sense to keep Barzal as your second line center, and you need to get more time for Richie. So in that case, I think you have to trade Pageau. A lot of people are going to really focus on the standings when it comes to this Pageau decision. While I do think it's important to note that the Islanders do have to factor in where they are in the standings. And I think if they are low enough, I think you just have to sell no matter what. I don't think the standings should be the only factor that goes into this Pageau decision. If the Islanders truly believe, and even if they are low in the standings, if they believe they can field a competitive team next year and Pageau is the best for them both now and 3 years in the future, then I understand signing him for a longer term. But the Islanders should not make this decision just based on where they are in the standings this year. Even if they're first in the division, if they don't see a future with Pageau, if they can't get a contract done that works for the team and the player, then it doesn't make sense for the Islanders to keep Pageau. It doesn't make sense to do if it does not work for both now and the future. Because while it is exciting that this team is overperforming early expectations, and Pageau is a valuable player who I don't think is going to really hit a plateau anytime soon. I don't think he is what he is, but I don't think he's really showing any signs of regression at this point. He's been very consistent throughout his career. Even if in the last year he is a bit slower, he's the type of player that when the time comes for Danny Nelson to emerge as the third line center, you can then just rotate them and have Pageau. Yes, it'd be a little expensive that last year, but I don't think that's a big deal, especially when we consider what the rest of the center market looks like in the NHL. And this is why this is such an interesting decision for the New York Islanders. The center market in the NHL, especially the third line, because that's pretty much all that's left, other than Evgeny Malkin, who, let's face it, he is either going to retire or play more in Pittsburgh. I can't really see him going anywhere else. We'll see what happens. And maybe Nick Schmaltz. There is not a lot to all that in the market when it comes to centers in general. And it's really interesting, too, because almost every team in the NHL right now, if you listen to Elliot Friedman, listen to all the insiders, they talk about how every single team is looking for more centers. This is ranked based on like the highest paid players, so it's not necessarily the best players. That gives you a pretty good idea of what's available. Kevin Hayes at this point, I don't even know if he's an NHL regular anymore. Anze Kopitar is retiring. Anders Lee, as we know, isn't even a center, and he's listed on this. That's how it's a little messy here. But my point is, other than Christian Dvorak, Charlie Coyle, Alexander Wenberg, and maybe if you want to add a Jason Dickinson, maybe Boone Jenner, although Boone Jenner can't stay healthy at all. Other than those players on this list, there really are no third line centers available at all, which, in addition to Pageau having more value on the trade deadline, this also gives him more value in terms of any team that needs a center, both now and in the future, is probably looking at this list and realizing it isn't great. And even if you go down the list, Adam Lowry just signed his contract, it does not get much better. Eric Holla is the only other player I would say is of note and value in the center conversation. Scott Laughton used to be a player that I thought was interesting. At this point, he's a fourth line center for the Toronto Maple Leafs. There really are not that many options out there. One more I will note is Jack Roslovic from the Edmonton Oilers. So I will point out, I think he's more of a winger at this point. And you could say that about a couple of these center options. Just because they're listed as center, the center market's even worse than this looks because a lot of these players aren't able to consistently play center the way Pageau does. So the Islanders have a decision really here because realistically, it's not like you can trade Pageau and then just sign another cheap Pageau option. While there are going to be options available, they are definitely not going to be as good as Pageau. And more importantly, realistically, they're going to end up costing the same amount as Pageau or even more because with this market being so diluted, teams are going to overpay. I mean, we saw that last year with the Flyers. It was a one-year contract, but they offered Christian Dvorak $5.4 million to be their third-line center this year. He's actually playing a lot of second-line center this year. But the point is, with this situation with Pageau, this gives him more value if the Islanders choose to trade him because teams looking to the future are going to understand, hey, the third line center market is only going to get worse. And trust me, by the end of this offseason, by the time we get to this offseason, most of these players are going to be gone to make this even worse than it is right now. So as a result, the Islanders have some value here if they choose to trade Pageau. But you can also look at this list and make an argument that this is just a reason why I should hold on to a player like Pageau I think Schaefer's emergence, like playing so well, so young, has kind of maybe made this situation more complicated for the Islanders. This is a situation where this team looked like a complete rebuild, a complete project. It would make absolutely no sense for the Islanders to retain Pageau. But now that some pieces are starting to come together, and this team is starting to look really competitive in this Metro Division, well, not just this year, but for the next few years to come, based on what they have, you could really make the argument that perhaps the Islanders could use Pageau for the next 3 seasons. Perhaps there is more of a window there than we expected. But I'd love to know your thoughts on this conversation in the comments below. With Pageau, I think my final thoughts are, I think you do have to move them if the offers get to a certain point. We don't know what the offers are going to be like, or if the Islanders are even shopping him at this point. But I think if you're getting a first, more than a first, then I think you have to trade him no matter what. But if that's not really the case, maybe you're getting like a second or third or something like that, I think it's a really interesting conversation on whether you trade Pageau or you keep him for the next 3 or 4 seasons. 4 is probably a little too much, but if you can get him for 3 years at $5 million, I think that's a really interesting option. It's going to be really interesting to see what the Islanders decide to do as this season goes on. As always, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. I'm your host, Patrick Nilan. Catch you on the next episode of Islanders Digest. Let's go, Islanders.